Today I'm speaking with Iryna Shuvalova, a poet, translator, and scholar from Ukraine. She holds an MA in comparative literature from Dartmouth College, where she was a Fulbright scholar, and a PhD in Slavonic studies from the University of Cambridge, where she was a Gates Cambridge scholar. Her research interests lie at the intersection of culture and politics in Eastern Europe. As of early 2022, she authored 5 books of poetry, including the bilingual Pray to the Empty Wells, published by Lost Horse Press in 2019. Her most recent collection, Stone Orchard Woods, has been recognized as the Poetry Book of the Year by Ukraine's Lit-Accent Prize for Literature, and she received the special prize for the Lviv UNESCO City of Literature Book Award. Meanwhile, her new book of poems in Ukrainian titled The Ending Songs is scheduled to appear in print in 2022. Shuvalova's writing has been widely anthologized and featured in periodicals in Ukraine and abroad. Her work as a translator includes most recently translations into Ukrainian of poems by Louise Glick and Alice Oswald. Among her book-length translation projects are Rupa Kaur's Milk and Honey and Jan Martel's Life of Pi, as well as an unpublished volume of selected poems of Ted Hughes. Welcome, Iryna. It's a pleasure to speak with you. And I have to say, before we begin the kind of more formal part of this conversation, I have to ask you about these unpublished poems of Ted Hughes. How did you come to be translating them?
In fact, I've been reading Ted Hughes's work for many years, and it's always been my dream to have a book of his poems out in Ukrainian. However, as you might know, in Ukraine, it's rather difficult to publish poetry in translation. And so this project has been completed probably around 2015. And it's still, you know, in my drawer, and I take it out sometimes and I look at it. But Hughes is one of my favorite poets. And also when I went to a fellowship at Hawthornden, so the Hawthornden Writers' Residence in Scotland, I was delighted to discover. So I went was a totally different project. I was planning to work on a collection of my own poems, and then I arrived there. And I see this memorial plaque, which actually has Hughes's profile, very recognizably, but no information on it. And so I go to the administration of the program and I ask, so what does this place have to do with Ted Hughes? And they say, oh, in fact, he was great friends with the lady who founded the program, and he would often come over here, and he actually used to fish a lot in this little stream next to the house. And so I realized suddenly that my project would be very, very different. And I went to the library and they had a great collection of Hughes's works. And that's how I have put together essentially his selected poems from, you know, throughout his career. So I really hope this will materialize at some point as a book in Ukrainian, because Hughes is one of those voices that I would love to be heard and read in my language.
That's wonderful to hear. I have to tell you that I remember meeting him many years ago.
Lucky you.
He was visiting Seamus Heaney when Seamus was in residence at Harvard, and Seamus had a group of us over and very formally introduced us to him. And it was he made such a powerful impression. It was though a rock was speaking to you. There was something so solid and earthbound to him.
But I think his voice is also a very, very special voice. I mean, he has done a lot of radio recordings, and I think one of the reasons was his voice just being so powerful, like you said. Yes. Oh, lucky you. I envy you in the best way possible.
It was a memorable experience. Anyway, I also noticed that you edited an anthology of queer poetry. Is that right?
Yes, it was not just poetry. So we also had some a selection of short prose included. But yes, so this was writing from different countries. Edited by us, was a wonderful preface by Vitaly Chernetsky. And, you know, it was, 2009, I think, at that point, quite a few years ago. We had a bit of trouble presenting it at the book forum in Lviv. We had some radical right-wing groups attempt to attack us and, you know, trying to throw things at us and threatening us. But I'm so happy that that project materialized at that stage. But at the same time, I'm sorry to say that it actually remains the only anthology of queer writing published in Ukraine until now, which, thinking that it's been quite a few years, is a pity, to be honest. But it's a very memorable, very special project for me.
Yeah, no, congratulations on all these firsts. Those are very meaningful and dramatic projects. Good for you. So I wanted to ask, our hope here is to really get a record of the work you'd been doing before the war. But even before that, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about where you grew up and under what circumstances. I believe you're originally from Kyiv, is that right?
Yeah, so I was born in Kyiv, and strangely for Kyiv, both of my parents come from Kyiv, but not my grandparents. So I can't claim to be, a third, fourth, etc. generation Kyivite. I grew up in a very simple family, in a working class family. So my grandparents, none of them were able to really, they never attended, they never got higher education, but they also haven't really graduated even from secondary school. So for example, my mother's parents, because I grew up with my mother, my parents were divorced. So for example, they only had a couple of years of primary school education. So they were able to read and write, but on a very basic level, and never really had access to anything more. So those were peasant families that, in the turmoil of post-Second World War migrations, came to the urban centers to earn their living, to get some better chances in life, and they met, and that's how our family came to be. So I grew up with my mother and was my maternal grandparents. And yes, like I said, I had a very simple life, a very simple start in life. I had no clue what I wanted to do with myself because my interests seemed to be somewhat at odds with a lot of my peers, because remember, we were the generation of the very early 2000s, and it was still a highly unstable time in Ukraine, economically speaking. And so everyone essentially wanted their children to be lawyers and study management and economics and business and all those things that were supposed to give you some good foundation in life. However, I was very lucky, despite the fact that, like I said, we didn't have much to begin with, but my family never pressured me into following a specific path. So I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy, because that seemed like the only thing that I couldn't really figure out and that intrigued me. So I had no clue what I would study, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions in my life. In fact, I still think that it gave me these tools and taught me to think in a way that I can apply in different fields. So I did my undergraduate studies in philosophies and my master's also in philosophy.
Who are the philosophers that you engaged with most intensely?
So I was interested in philosophy of language, however, not in the analytical tradition. So not in the US tradition. I was actually interested in hermeneutics and phenomenology and the ways they dealt with language. So I actually spent quite a few years looking at Gustav Spät, who was a very interesting figure. He was, unfortunately, he perished in Stalin's repressions. So he was sent to Siberia and killed. But before that, he was a man was an amazing life story. He was I think, from a Polish nobleman's family. He grew up in Kyiv. But of course, that being very early 20th century, he went on to make his career in Moscow. But he spent quite some time in Germany. He was actually one of Husserl's pupils, Edmund Husserl. But when he came back to Russia, he didn't want to just continue the phenomenological tradition and not didn't want to be just a phenomenologist, but what he was interested in was combining phenomenology with hermeneutics. And he was, in the years before his untimely death, actually interested in looking at the language of poetry, which is absolutely amazing if you think that this is what a couple of decades later, Martin Heidegger, another Husserl's pupil, will be doing, combining phenomenology and hermeneutics and looking at the language of poetry. So an amazing and also very eccentric figure from what we know about him. But that's what I was doing. And then I ended up spending a couple of years in a PhD program, also at the University of Kiev, where I earned my several first degrees. But then I started really feeling that I was drifting away from just doing philosophy. I wanted to do something else. And, I was already reading, performing, publishing my poetry, and I felt that literature really was taking up more and more space in my life. And I also felt that I wanted to engage with it academically as well. So I didn't complete that PhD. Instead, I went on and I got another graduate degree in translation. And actually, part of my thesis wasn't at Hughes. And that was part of my, essentially, I was translating his poetry and I was also looking theoretically how that could be done. And then, then I went on a Fulbright to do an MA in comparative literature, finally deciding it was about time to do that. And then when I did my doctorate at Cambridge a year later, after I completed my MA, it was essentially tying together also threads, because what I ended up doing was I studied the war at that point we said the war in Donbass, right? So the Russo-Ukrainian war. And I was interested in examining the popular culture that was the processes in the popular cultures that were happening around that war. But I was also very interested in how the popular cultural material was reflecting the processes in the communities affected by the war. And so I was asking essentially how these communities identify themselves, because there's always the us and the them in the war songs, in the war cultural production. And this is what I was looking at. So I was studying popular songs, but I was studying them from the point of view of how do people express or reshape their identities through songs. And that was, broadly speaking, cultural anthropology. And that's, I guess, where my background in philosophy and literature and my experience as a writer all came together.
Oh, fascinating. Derek Walcott, the St. Lucian poet, used to say that a poet's proper friends and companions ought to be philosophers and historians. So it's interesting that you have gravitated to that yourself. I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear where you see the intersection of philosophy and poetry and how the two different media pursue reflections on experience. For instance, I know that the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben talks about how fiction is, in fact, precisely where he believes the sort of sacred literature of today lies, because he regards it as an initiation into and by life itself. That is to say, it is a medium in which experience, feeling, sensuality, and thought and ideas kind of can work together best to reflect what life on Earth is really like. I'm curious about what you see, what role you see poetry playing that touches on the mission of philosophy. Because after all, from philosophers, I expect a pursuit of wisdom. From poets, I expect something, perhaps not always that, perhaps not always a pursuit of wisdom.
Well, first of all, it's interesting because one of the last conversations I had with my academic supervisor before I ended up dropping out of the first PhD program I was in was really close to that. We were talking about late Martin Heidegger. And I was really fascinated in his take on poetry, which is not uncontroversial. And Heidegger might be considered a controversial figure for a whole number of reasons, right? But in that respect, specifically in Ukraine, for example, he's not uncontroversial also because of the way he writes, the way he produces a philosophical text, which in its style and essence is really close to poetry. So the way he works with language, the way he produces new words, the way he really works on the level of the rhythm of his writings, the syntax, it's very close to poetry at some points. And so the disagreement I had with my academic advisor was that I was saying, this is great philosophy. And he was saying, oh, this is more like some sort of, he became a mad prophet in a sense in his later years. So, but really, I think that what philosophers and poets are really doing is very similar. I think we both poke our fingers at reality and we see what happens. It's just, I think we poke, like the fingers are different, right? So I think philosophers tend to poke, let's say, with their intellectual finger, pardon for the, somewhat phallic metaphor. But then, as poets, we do it with our language, right? And then again, that's not very different. I think what poets tend to produce after doing that poking operation has somewhat more variety than what philosophers produce sometimes, but I think that's exactly the matter of convention. So what we just, what we just mentioned about Heidegger was just his way of doing something different as a result of his thinking, of his engagement with reality than other philosophers were doing. So obviously what he wrote didn't sound like what Immanuel Kant wrote, or any of the other philosophers who were venerated in that classical German traditions that he grew out of. But again, since then, we have seen so many wonderful thinkers engage and write philosophy in very, very different ways. And Agamben is a great example as well. So I really like his writing. And, and we have Foucault, and we have wonderful feminist thinkers. We have Judith Butler, who writes, actually you could argue quite close to that classical tradition, very intense writing. But then we have someone like Bell Hooks, for example. And so I think we can see more of that variety and more of that liberation of the philosophical thought from out those confines of what the writing of philosophy should look like. And so in a sense, I feel that with that, philosophy is getting even closer to poetry. In a sense, they are performing the same mission, the mission of exploring the reality and getting to the meat of reality and to the essence of reality, but they're just doing it from different angles. But I think it's just so beautiful to see that merging. It's almost, I like thinking about that as a spectrum almost. And it's just, we are getting more of those threads drawn across the center of that spectrum. I mean, we've had more of, poets who were also philosophers, right? But it's lovely. I love that we are getting more philosophers who also are not afraid to be poets right now.
That's beautifully said. So let me just return you back to poetry in Ukraine and in Kyiv as you were growing up and entering into the literary world. My first contact, kind of direct contact with Ukrainian poets came in 1990 when I met a number of young writers then who have become really kind of established and important voices in Ukrainian literature, from Oksana Zabushko, Yuri Andrukhovich, Sashko Irvanech, Viktor Naborak, Petro Medyanka, and that whole generation. I'm wondering what your generation was reading. Solomia Pavlichko was also part of that world. And I was wondering who of that kind of local and immediate poets were in any way influential or valuable to you, or whether you found your sort of influences and inspiration elsewhere.
That's a lovely question, in a sense, because remember I told you I envy you in a very good way for having met Ted Hughes, right? In the same way, I think I always have envied a little bit in a very good way my friends and colleagues who have grown up in the houses, full of books, or who were able to meet, those wonderful people directly. That was not the case for me. I grew up, we did have a lot of books in our house, and I always read voraciously, but there was no one to really guide my reading efforts. And so whatever I discovered myself. My bookshelves were full of Alexander Dumas and, whatnot, Fenimore Cooper and everything, the classics, so to say, of the Soviet repertoire, of, the imagined Western canon, through the prism of the Soviet system of that time. But so I was discovering things chaotically, really. And the first thing I was reading, just because they were more accessible, were in Russian translation. I really liked Marina Tsvetaeva. I still remember discovering her book in the library. And it was a very big book, and I must have been about 8 or 9. But I was absolutely amazed by the fact that someone was writing like that. There was freedom in that writing, and there was daring in that writing. And then, I read Lorca, and I have fallen in love with Lorca. And it was also freedom, but not so much expressed stylistically in language, but in his imagery. It was that imagery which was, I now would say, the imagery of folk songs, and then kind of, the poesis of folk songs that was particularly striking. But of course, at the same time, at school, I was engaging with Ukrainian writing, of course. And, I would go to those Olympiads, so contests that, all the good students in Ukrainian secondary schools would go to. And I won some prizes. I was a good student. But I could not really connect to that. I felt the power in it, but I felt I was behind the wall, shut off from that power. So just to give you a little example, it was probably at the age of 12 or 13 that I actually played Lesa Ukrainka in a school play. And there was a point in the play when it was towards the end of the performance, I had to have a crown of thorns put on my head in a very subtle, some subtle imagery. And I still remember that there was a little jar with red paint hidden under that cardboard tree. And so at one point, when other people were doing something at the front of the stage, I had to lean and put some of that red paint on my forehead. Because of course, if you're wearing a crown of thorns, you need to have something red on your forehead. So that was the approach that was cultivated, and I didn't connect with that. It felt alien, it felt different. And so essentially, I would say that in a strange way, I was discovering Ukrainian poetry or the potential of Ukrainian poetry through my writing first, before I actually started to properly explore it through my reading. I mean, of course, later I would read Stus, of course, later I would read, at one point I was really fascinated by Olzhich, for example, of course, I would read Chubai, but all that would happen later. And really, because I have been writing since I was very young, I was rhyming before I was writing, and my mother was just, following me and writing those things down. And then there was some, embarrassing poems, about Kalina, and I went through all those stages, but somehow I continued writing, and I continued looking for my voice, and I think eventually I did find it. But I was at the university when I really got in touch and connected with other poets of my generation. I mean, at the same time, for example, Bogdan Oleksandr was, studying at the same time in a different faculty, and of course, through him, I met other poets, and we had this little literary studio, which was called Svicha do Slova. So both a mirror of the word, but also a candle for the word. So we always had little candlelit get-togethers. And actually that studio it was not really a studio in a sense, it was not guided, it was not mentored, it was just us coming together, giving each other feedback, reading some poetry. But it has produced some wonderful voices. I mean, Oleksandr was part of it, for example. Anna Vovchenko, who is a wonderful translator, was part of it. Dmitro Chistak, etc. So quite a few names that would be familiar. I think at that point, what I remember very clearly is that we were fascinated by the discovery of the lost voices, so to say. I mean, never really lost, but for us, they were new. So for example, I really vividly remember how Semenko and the futurists were being read again. And that was such a discovery for us. So we really felt, I think at that stage, like the gaps were being filled, because in a sense, we felt that our voices were coming from somewhere. Maybe I should speak for myself. I felt, maybe other people were much better read than I was, but I felt my voice was also coming from somewhere, but I was really not entirely sure where from. So I felt that there was much more out there than what I knew. And of course, I was picking out bits and pieces and, reconstructing the bigger picture. But I also felt that while I was doing that on a personal level, in a sense, that was also what my generation of poets was doing more broadly, just trying to see the bigger picture, just trying to look into those, erased voices and reconnect with them in a meaningful way. And so I think that was really the sense of excitement and just feeling that there's so much more out there that we ought to know, that we ought to connect with, and that is just genuinely alive. For me, that was the point of, having that wall between me and Ukrainian poetry, finally cracking and breaking. And it really felt like a very, very liberating point.
I can imagine. Your generation was also, I think, probably the first that was able then to go outside of Ukraine and begin to study abroad. And I was wondering how those experiences began to filter into your own reading and your understanding of poetry, and also especially of Ukrainian poetry, because I'd like to claim to friends that Ukraine is the only country I know of that was really founded by a poet. And I don't know whether you would agree that poetry seems to play a singularly important role in Ukrainian culture. So I'm wondering
I absolutely agree. And maybe let me speak about that first, and then I will go back to this point of going out of Ukraine. I would agree completely that I do think poetry in Ukraine is incredibly important and has been incredibly important. And that actually I can go back to the point when I was thinking about my PhD project. And again, you might say, well, I was writing about popular songs, like what is there to connect it with poetry, etc. But in reality, my initial thinking was I wanted to engage with oral material. And really popular culture is the new orality of today. It's this space of the vernacular. It's this space of those interconnections made quickly. It's multimedia. It's a multimedia space, which in reality, oral culture has always been. If you think about how easily theater merges with poetry, how the performative and the visual and the textual in oral poetry often comes together. It's always the act of narration, which is really inseparable often in traditional oral culture from the act of creation of the text, and this dubious let's say attribution of the text. So that was my thinking. But the reason why I wanted to work with oral material actually goes back to my family history, because I do come from the lineage of people, I remember very well, for example, that, my grandmother and my grandfather had trouble reading and never read much, and, for no fault of their own. And they couldn't really, they would write me very small things on the postcards that I still treasure, but they would not really write elaborate, long, beautiful letters or poems or novels, not really. And we have a bit of a family legend, so to say, and that's about my grandmother's father, who was one of the few literate men in this tiny village in Sumy region where she grew up. And he loved reading. So formally, he was keeping the church books. So he was entering, the births and the deaths and the marriages. But he also loved reading secular literature. And he had to hide it from his neighbors because he was a father of 10 children. He had to do other things, and reading was considered to be something silly. And again, partly because very few other people could read. They didn't really understand the process itself. Mm-hmm. And so my grandmother, who hasn't read many books in her life, already in her late 70s, she would remember how she said, well, I remember my father telling me a story about this man who sailed on a boat, and then his boat capsized, and he found himself on an island, and he planted a vegetable garden there. So that's my grandmother telling me the story of Robinson Crusoe without knowing who Robinson Crusoe was, because her father, he would read those books hiding from the neighbors, but then he would tell them as stories to his children. So that amazing power of the oral tradition, I think it really kept Ukraine, the language, the people, the culture going. And of course, this example was more of a narrative tradition, but really poetry, I think, kept the richness of language when it was banned elsewhere, right? When Ukrainian couldn't be published, but you could never prohibit, people from telling stories and singing songs. And I do feel that Ukrainian poetry today still carries that power, still carries that charge. In a sense, it's really like an electric charge. And I think now that we, unfortunately, under such sad circumstances, but we are in the spotlight. Ukrainian poetry, in part, is in the spotlight. I do feel like our readers, our listeners, including those coming from other language traditions, I think they actually do feel that electric charge. A lot of people who come to our readings, this is the feedback they give. They say, it's powerful, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's partly the power of that tradition that survived, that morphed, that existed in many, many forms and through many voices. And I love the beauty of it. I like thinking of those many voices that echo in our voices today. So that's in terms of that tradition. And as we're going, yes, really reading in other languages and being exposed to other poetic traditions, that's, I think it has been an entirely transformative experience. I remember still when we were just beginning and, some people were writing rhyme poetry, some people were writing, free verse. And there was also a sense of this, a bit of a confrontation between people writing free verse and people writing rhymed poetry. And one was considered to be of a more of a classical or modernist or broadly more appropriate thing, I might even say, depends on who the reader or the commenter was. And free verse, really, I still remember in the early 2000s was often considered something a little frivolous or a little suspect, really. And now I understand that partly this perception was due to the fact that people really didn't encounter free verse, first of all, in the language of the original, and we didn't even have enough translations in Ukrainian of the great tradition. It was English language tradition, but also the Spanish, the Hispanophone, right? Would that be Hispanophone tradition? And so really, we got it all filtered through the prism of largely Russian translations, which is incredible pity, and you remember I told you, I read Lorca as a child, and of course, in Gillespie's translations, and I loved it. And then when I learned a little bit of Spanish, and I dared to read Lorca in the original, and I realized he sounded nothing like those translations, nothing like it. And so, yes, I do feel like we just embrace the plurality of the possibilities in our language much more freely and really with abandonment always, almost, now that we have access to those other linguistic spaces, other poetic spaces, but also other cultural spaces. And I really feel that this is something we are still lacking in a sense. I mean, obviously we are making huge advances, you know, it's the interaction we are having now with poets and readers from other countries is amazing, and it's really accelerating. But I still feel sometimes that almost is this cultural exposure. The more of that is coming, you know, the more amazing will be the poems and the books of poetry written and published in Ukraine. I really believe in that. I think we still have so much unused potential. Ukrainian language is brilliant for poetry. I mean, I love other languages, you know, I love English. I translate into English and from English. And, you know, it's the language I often use in my everyday life. But I still think that Ukrainian is absolutely incredible for poetry. I mean, phonetically speaking, syntactically speaking, there's everything there. And we haven't even used up, you know, probably 1/10 of its potential. So a lot to look forward to.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, as you were speaking about translation, I remembered that as a kid, I actually came across a number of translations of both poets and fiction writers in Ukrainian first before I read them in English, because my mother subscribed to Seshvit. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes,
it was a journal of translation. And so as I recall, she was reading Marquez in Ukrainian before I was reading him in English, and other writers like that. So I came across there too. So there's so many directions in which we could go here to follow up, but I also want to bring us a little bit up to date. As you've gone out into the world, you really have gone out into the world, from the US to the UK, and I don't know whether you found any particular differences or whether you connected at all with contemporary British poetry and culture. And in any case, you now find yourself in China. So if you could perhaps just give us a bit of a sense of the trajectory from Cambridge to where you are now, and how that has, how you've been absorbing all that in your own work as well.
Absolutely. So this has been a fascinating transition for me in terms of, again, traveling to a completely unfamiliar cultural environment, right? And I say completely unfamiliar in the sense that, of course, I have been, for example, watching contemporary Chinese cinema for years, and I have been reading about China and its history and its, you know, present day situation. But of course, you know, being somewhere, it's so important for the poet, you know, really hearing the sounds, you know, feeling the smells, tasting, you know, the new land, breathing it, touching it, it's the textures, the colors, all that. So that obviously, you know, was a huge stimulus to write. And I have written, you know, quite a few poems about China. And I guess also, you know, in a sense, trying to reflect on that moving from place to place as well. I think this is what I've been writing a lot about in this as of yet unpublished last manuscript, the ending songs. Because I think this question of continuity, when we move between different places and we move between different languages and cultures, for me at least, I've been asking myself increasingly, so what remains when you transform yourself, when you immerse yourself in using new environment every time? So what is there that remains unchanged, and how do you even capture that part of yourself? How do you detect it? And does it really exist? Do we really remain unchanged in any way, right, throughout our lives?
Is there such a thing as a self at all, right, as Buddhists?
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. So that was one part of it. And of course, you know, it was just a difficult experience in a sense of, you know, just living in a place that's very different and installing all the apps on my phone, without which you can't possibly survive in China, because everything is done through the apps, and they are many. And as I keep discovering, a lot of Chinese people don't really know how to use them or don't understand what to do with them. But beyond that, so what brought me to China was essentially this desire to pause in, ironically, in working very closely on the war material, because I spent 3 years looking at war songs, and I studied not just the material created in Ukraine, but also what was being produced in the occupied territories. And that was a mixed bag, as you might imagine, and also what was being produced in Russia. So I did look closely at the propaganda material, because it was very important for me to see that multiplicity of narratives being constructed around this war. But that took a rather heavy toll on me. And I felt by the end of my project, by the end of those 3 years, I naively thought that I needed a little break, which, of course, didn't happen. So in a sense, that also really does tell about how naive I was, in a sense that, the war has been going on since 2014. The war, wouldn't go away. So I tried to go away from it. And it didn't really work. It never works. That was the biggest lesson of it. It never works, even if the recent escalation didn't happen. I mean, we continue to be affected by that war. It's just that I tried to tell myself that I could be affected somewhat less for a while. It doesn't really work that way. We understand that now, but obviously, after the escalation did happen in February, I have been writing a lot, not so much about China now, but about what was happening back home. Because also I found myself in this rather peculiar situation. As you know, the borders of China are almost entirely shut still due to COVID.
Right.
In reality, so even for us to enter the country, I mean, my work contract was supposed to start in August, and we couldn't get in until November, really, just because of how strict and slow the process is. And so due to this, for example, we are unable to bring anyone here, really. So members of families of Chinese nationals can enter the country, but not members of foreign professionals living or working here. Mm-hmm. So that means, for example, that my mom, who was remaining in Kyiv, when she became displaced, she left Ukraine, and we couldn't bring her here. So in a sense, initially she went to Greece. Just because, my ex-husband was from Greece. So there was a place where I went for, quite a few years, a town that I knew well, where at least I could, from afar, try to create a more or less convenient environment for her. Also for her, it was a huge stress. And actually, so my mom is in her 60s. And that's the generation which I think still hasn't really had the chance to experience that freedom of movement, that access to other languages, other cultures. And so, for example, I managed to talk my mom out of getting to, into getting to safety, because she was essentially on her own also. So we are her only family. But I know that a lot of her friends, some of whom are in very dangerous situations, really, they are too afraid to go somewhere, because for them it's a step into a complete unknown. So for now, my mom is displaced. So now she was in Greece, and she will be moving on to England very soon.
I can imagine the language issue must be very challenging, both in Greece and
yes, she's brave. She's trying to be brave, and she's saying, "Oh, let's say it's an adventure." But I know it's very tough for her. She does speak a little bit of English, but just a little bit. And she's going through the Homes for Ukraine program run by the UK government. So she will be hosted by a family, who we did find through friends, but it's still living in someone else's home, and it's tough for someone who, who like my mom, she spent her whole life in Kyiv. She loves her home. She had to leave everything behind, and obviously, we don't know whether that home will be there when the war will be over. But also, my partner is still in Ukraine. My father and half brother are in territorial defense in Kyiv. So it's hard to be here, not being able to visit or to bring anyone here, or just to be with the people I love. I'm very grateful for the fact that my daughter is with me. But other than that, it's been quite challenging in that respect. And so I think for me, it was important to reflect on the difference in our experiences. And I'm still, I think, coming to terms with the fact that I am not under immediate threat. I am very fortunate to have a comfortable life here. It's safe. We have, food on our table and roof above our heads, and, a very supportive community as well. So I work in an international school, and, we have a very diverse, very inclusive, very supportive community. However, at the same time, my loved ones are either under threat or, in very uncertain circumstances. And I think I still can't really bring myself to fully feel or let myself fully feel sad or unwell for myself. I don't think I let myself embrace that, because I don't feel like I have enough reason to do that. But I rather try to channel those feelings into doing something constructive and helping, my loved ones, but also other people in the war effort.
No, absolutely, and I can imagine how stressful it is. I mean, it is. I've got family in Lviv, but friends all over the country, and
yes.
It seems that just when you begin to think that at least, it was a terrible thing to say, but at least the war is focused in one area, and you discover, in fact, it's not, and no one quite knows how it's going to evolve.
The situation is evolving.
My heart goes out to you and to the anxiety that you must be feeling, because in many ways feeling things at a distance is almost more challenging than being there in the reality, because in the way our imagination works, we can project many more fears, whereas when you're dealing with the reality, you're simply responding to those sort of physical circumstances, and in a way you know what you're dealing with. Whereas when you're at a distance, you're really not sure what anybody's dealing with. And so you let your
Thank you for saying that, Askold. This is what my partner keeps telling me, because, when I tell her, I don't want to feel bad because I have no reason to feel bad. And she always tells me, well, it's okay to feel bad as well. And, sometimes when it's important for me to know about their experiences and the way, my loved people are feeling. And actually, one of the things she tells me is that, yes, it's not just because you are outside Ukraine that you can't really fit this experience, because this is what I say, I can't fit this experience of war into my reality. It doesn't fit. My grandma had this wonderful phrase, "Na голову не налазить."
Right.
You can't fit it, you can't fit your head through it. And that's exactly it. And she tells me, you know what? We feel the same way. And not just her, I mean, my friends, fellow poets, they all say this, we go through the motions, we do what needs to be done, but no one really fully comprehends this, because this is so much bigger than what any of us can comprehend. But I also feel like this is where the language of poetry is, in a sense, I don't want to say helpful, that's not the right word, but it's a surgical tool. It lets us dissect this reality and look inside and see a little bit of it the way we wouldn't otherwise if we just stayed on the surface. So I really feel that poetry here, and the language of poetry, is an extremely powerful tool for getting a glimpse of what is really happening when we cannot possibly connect fully on the day-to-day level with what is really happening.
That's absolutely, that's so very well said. I mean, in part because every war is the result of the debasement of language. and the corruption of language, the corruption of diction, at the very kind of basic level, when words cease to have any correspondence to what is actually happening or what people mean when they speak in public and when politicians speak in the agora. It is almost impossible to get any sense of reality from that, and that's where intuition and feeling and the kind of subtle maneuvering of kind of verbal maneuvering that is an essential element of every poet's sort of toolkit can begin to get under the skin of the surface of a phenomenon that is so otherwise unimaginable. I mean, I'm sure that when you were in England, you probably immersed yourself in the poetry, the English poetry of the First World War, the poets like Wilbur Owen and David Jones, and their attempts, in fact, to convey to civilians who are at a distance from the war what it actually was like from the inside. And it's true that I think poetry is one of the best sort of mediums we have for conveying that.
I also, if I may just add something, I just remembered. So I recall in 2014, it just so happens that I had 2 books of poetry out. And so I was touring Ukraine with those 2 books, doing presentations and talking a lot with the readers who would come to those presentations in 2014, right? So I was doing the tour in fall. It was, several months essentially after the war broke out in the Donbass. And so I do remember a lot of people asking, how do we, in a very simplified way, but how do we speak about this? Like, how can we write about war, or just asking things about war, really? And I was really surprised by that, and I was really not sure what to say. But then I did realize that people were looking to poetry for answers, and also looking for answers in language itself. Because for me, it was not that I couldn't answer just because I didn't have the ideas, the concepts, right? It was also that my language itself was lacking. And I think when in this second cycle, in the sense of this war, I felt the same thing, but even more acutely. I wrote a short cycle of poems, which is called To Write About War, which is precisely just me writing about how I cannot write. And at one point, I really struggled. When I was starting to write the first poems, I really did not even understand how I can say any word, how any word would fit into this experience or be able to reflect this experience. And at one point in the poem, I do say that it's a point, writing about war is a point where language becomes something like a croak, a sound that is almost an animal sound, really, because how can this meaning be carried in language? It's just impossible. The language just falls apart, and we have to somehow rebuild it to be able to speak about these things, because we cannot not speak about these things. Right. But it's impossible. And it really makes me look, you've mentioned, the English poetry of the First World War, but also really look at war poetry and other traditions of other times as this reinvention of language every time, just because we cannot really speak in the same way about the experience that is unspeakable in itself. Every time new, every time unspeakable.
Right. I'm thinking of a poem like George Herbert's Episode in the Library. I don't know if you recall that poem. It's a brief prose poem, and in it he is watching a student in a library scanning a line of verse, putting little marks on where the iambic pentameter is, and the narrator, speaker of the poem, goes on to say, "I remembered when they carried his body away from the front." And so he's recalling the death of the poet himself, and saying that what he's now seeing is the death of words, as words are being turned into these symbols for scansion and into something mechanical, and I think, but I do think that a line like Auden's about suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters, in his poem, Le Musée des Beaux-Arts, conveys at least something of the limits of language, and even recognizing, as you said, that there is a point beyond which an experience requires a kind of respectful silence and a kind of empathic immersion of the reader into an experience that is beyond language, is a kind of a threshold moment for both the writer and the reader, and it is something that, again, that poetry can bring us close to. Anyway, so under the circumstances, I wonder what you think is effective action for those of us who are removed and really kind of at a great distance to this experience. I'm sure you've mentioned the sort of support and camaraderie even that you have found among writers in China, and perhaps you've also been in touch with and taken part in some of the international events of writers. As we begin to recognize that this could be a longer process than we all hope it will be, I think that many of us here are wondering how we can continue to engage and sustain and keep the world's attention on what is happening in Ukraine. Are there any sort of suggestions you might have along those lines and hopes you might have?
Right. My biggest hope, beyond, of course, we do still need the day-to-day help and the day-to-day action, which millions really of volunteers are doing all over the world. It's incredible, and it's needed, and it's an urgent effort. But in a sense, it's almost like trying to stop the bleeding. When the patient is bleeding, when someone is wounded and they're bleeding, the first thing is to sort of just to cover that wound and to stop the bleeding and to prevent that person from losing more blood than they can sustain. But beyond that, on a large scale, I think one of the most important missions is to decolonize the narratives around Ukraine and around the war in Ukraine. And this is something that, in Ukrainian studies, in academic circles, we have been talking about this for a while, right? One of the first academic articles on that would be Marko Pavlyshyn's, Cossack in Jamaica, and that's what, the early 90s, essentially. I think it's 1991, perhaps. And then, of course, there was brief engagement, was the issue of Ukraine as perhaps, but again, questionably post-colonial situation, like, can we call Ukraine post-colonial? There was that wonderful selection of short articles around that. Gayatri Spivak has a little piece, and Vitaly Chernetsky again wrote a little piece. But then again, it still remains something oddly of a marginal line of thinking about Ukraine, and again, sort of almost suspect for the more, let's say, serious scholars saying, well, colonial history is extremely important, which it is. And let's say, thinking about the global South, for example, through this post-colonial prism is extremely important. However, I would also absolutely argue that we need to think about, the empires and imperial heritage, not just in terms of, overseas colonies, but also in terms of the European empires, those of them like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and especially like the Russian Empire, which arguably remains the empire throughout the 20th century, and which, arguably remains in very much an imperial mindset today. And we need to understand and read the situation in Ukraine through that prism. And we need to understand, and I love that you mentioned how the language has been corrupted, and how that corruption of language is a first step towards any tragedy, any war. And I would absolutely argue that we need to think about how has language being colonized, not just Ukrainian language, right? But how the global narratives and the global, multilingual understanding of Ukraine has been absolutely colonized by the Russian narratives, by the concepts of Ukraine as this peripheral state, an insignificant state, a failing state, about just speaking about the Ukraine, speaking about Kiev. I'm still, I'm reading The Guardian, and I think, they're doing a brilliant job with their reporting on Ukraine, but time and again, they do use Russian transcription for so many Ukrainian geographical landmarks. And that's part of it. That must be part of an effort. We need to decolonize the language. We need to decolonize the narratives. We need to decolonize our thinking about Ukraine. And when I say we, I actually mean us, Ukrainians as well, both Ukrainians abroad and Ukrainians inside Ukraine, because we need to remember how many people inside Ukraine still remain in that framework constructed by the Russian propaganda. And that framework is not a framework of linear and clear narratives. It's a framework of chaos. I mean, Peter Pomerantsev said beautifully about it. He said, Russian propaganda is not about constructing a coherent narrative. Right. It's about creating a chaos, a confusion, and as a result, producing this impression of inability to know the truth, or maybe even questioning the very fact that there is some sort of truth. Yes. And we can see that now in the efforts, for example, of the Russian troll factories, that again, through the new media like TikTok and Twitter, are again producing those counter narratives, obscuring the truth, and trying to create that chaos in which the truth really might drown. It might drown. So it's our job to actually make those narratives of the truth really clear and to make sure they are heard. And also, I would say, making Ukrainian voices heard is incredibly important now. And again, it's not about giving Ukraine a voice. We have a voice. It's about the willingness to listen, and about providing platforms where those platforms need to be provided. And I think if that is done, which I believe is doable by the joint efforts of the global community and Ukrainian community, then I think that it will be a very, very important step towards a better future, not just for Ukraine, because I think by now it's really clear it's not just about the future of Ukraine. This war is not just Ukraine's war again, right? The way we put it.
Absolutely. It seems so much about democracy. I mean, I think yes. So many of the people that I speak with about these matters in the United States are very aware that this has many local implications for us here as we move into the next elections. We often terrify ourselves by imagining what would have happened had the last election gone differently and somebody else were in power in the White House today, and what kind of support Ukraine would and would not be getting under the circumstances. After all, the most common grammatical error, I like to say, is the lie, and it's out of the inflation of a lie that so much of this horror has come. I'm again reminded of Auden saying that all that we have is a voice to undo the painted lie, and it's I don't like to use words like responsibility of the poets, because I don't like to dictate to writers. I think that's the worst thing you can do. They all need to follow their own intuitions. The way they
then they resist anyway. We resist responsibility in a sense.
That's right. And it's a healthy and essential resistance. And your own life and work have clearly demonstrated how successful that resistance is when you really just follow your nose, follow your heart, follow your instincts, and let a sense of that kind of internal compass, that still small voice of conscience that is, after all, present in all individuals, lead you toward the truth, and toward that kind of many layers of unreality that you need to penetrate to get at the core of what matters. What matters right now, I agree with you entirely, is that these voices continue to be heard and new platforms continue to be found. I thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. We could go on, I think, for quite a while, but if there's anything, kind of last words you want to convey to your welcoming and eager American audiences here, this is the moment. Otherwise, we can continue to...
Well, first of all, also thank you for this conversation, and thank you for the platform. Really, this is what we were just talking about. I mean, this the voices and experiences, I think, need to be heard. And this is a chance for them to be heard. But also, just to emphasize one thing, we spoke about, the geopolitical implications of this war. But I would even sort of, going back to my background in philosophy, in a sense, I would speak more broadly. This war is also about the truth. Yes. And the possibility of the truth as such, yes. Because there are so many global powers that are watching very closely whether Putin will succeed with implementing his playbook exactly in obscuring the truth and the very possibility of truth. And if that proves to be successful, which it has proven to be successful already, but to a limited extent. So if that prevails, if that strategy wins, then we can expect this obstruction of truth to be happening in many more places, and I would say absolutely all around the globe. So we also need to remember that the very possibility of truth is being decided in this war. So this is a war not just for Ukraine, it's a war for truth itself. And I just would like to encourage everyone to remember it and, to help the truth win.